You found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. This is my conclusion to my 3-part series about Randy Galuza, whose last name I'm still not sure that I'm pronouncing right. Oh well, he's going to continue to show us how he doesn't understand even the most basic things about genetics and evolutionary biology.
If I'm going to look at this from an engineering perspective, I'm going to see evidences of something that engineers would call robustness.
Guess what? Robustness is taken into account in evolutionary biology.
In other words, these organisms, even though they're facing dynamic environments, are going to maintain certain basic elements. They can take a licking and keep on ticking. They're robust, but they're also going to have some plastic elements, which means that they can flex. They can change with some of these environmental changes.
In fact, that phenotypic plasticity is part of robustness in the broad sense, but there's also robustness in terms of being able to mutate extensively without that necessarily causing problems. Here's Dr. Dan Stern-Cardinal, a professor of evolutionary biology at Rutgers University and the owner of the YouTube channel Creation Myths, to tell us a bit more about robustness and phenotypic plasticity. His channel is linked in the description.
Hello everybody, I'm going to give you 2 examples of traits that we see in organisms that are actually phenotypes that can evolve through natural selection and other evolutionary mechanisms, even though at first it doesn't seem like that's the case. The first is called phenotypic plasticity, or sometimes just plasticity. This is when you can get a range of phenotypes, which is to say physical traits, from the exact same genotype based on environmental conditions. Plants are a great illustration of plasticity. In many cases, if you take 2 genetically identical plants, put one in an environment with plenty of sunlight and the other in a shady environment, they'll end up looking very different. In the sunny environment, the leaves will tend to be smaller, while the plant in the shade will have much larger leaves to soak up as much sunlight as possible. Again, this is in genetically identical plants, clones, so this difference can't be explained by differences in the alleles between the 2 plants. This might sound like individuals are responding in a conscious way to their environment, but plasticity is actually a phenotype that has a genetic component. That means it's heritable and can evolve via natural and artificial selection, as we'll see. This has been demonstrated experimentally with body size in fruit flies. Body size exhibits plasticity according to temperature, and flies have been selected for higher and lower levels of plasticity, showing how, rather than being kind of a conscious response to the environment, the ability to exhibit plasticity is itself an evolvable trait. That's from a 2002 paper called Selection Experiments and the Study of Phenotypic Plasticity by S.M. Shiner. The second trait I want to discuss is called robustness, or sometimes you'll hear the phrase mutational robustness. Robustness is the concept that a genome is resistant to harmful effects of mutations. If a genome is highly susceptible to damaging mutations, it has low robustness. But if it can tolerate many mutations without a significant effect on fitness, it's considered robust against mutations. Like plasticity, robustness is a phenotype that can evolve. We can see this most strikingly in fast-mutating viruses with small, dense genomes. This means that most of their genome is going to be actual genes, and most nucleotides are going to be constrained, meaning they're under selection against changes that occur via mutation. This is in contrast to, for example, the human genome, of which less than 2% codes for proteins and is mostly unconstrained. In other words, these small viral genomes subject to rapid mutations are inherently less robust than something like the human genome, meaning there is a much greater chance of mutations having a negative effect on fitness. But we can document such viruses evolving to maximize their robustness. To understand how this happens, I want to introduce the concept of a fitness landscape. This is a 2 or 3 or more dimensional representation of the fitness of specific genotypes in a specific environment. So just picture this as a two-dimensional graph. High fitness genotypes represented as peaks, while low fitness genotypes as valleys. I'm simplifying here, but think of a graph with genotype on the x-axis and fitness on the vertical y-axis. Any given genotype along that x-axis will correspond to some fitness value, and again, this is for a specific population in a specific environment. Now, some peaks in a fitness environment are going to be very high but very steep, meaning the fitness of that genotype is very high for that environment, but any deviation from it, even by one or two mutations, carries a significant cost. You could visualize this as the genotype, the individual, instead of being at the top of the peak, with just one or two mutations falling down the steep sides of that peak. Other peaks in that same landscape can be lower and broader, where the maximum achievable fitness for that peak is lower, but deviation from that maximum carries little, if any, cost. These wider, flatter peaks are more robust than tall, narrow peaks, even if the maximum is lower, because individuals with that genotype can have offspring carrying one or more mutations without having a significant negative effect. So let's go back to our fast mutating viruses. In such populations, viruses can achieve the absolute highest peak, but because they mutate so rapidly, it's impossible to maintain. And because such peaks are often tall but very narrow, with any deviation from that optimum, even very similar genotypes, the mutated offspring of those most fit viruses are actually pretty mediocre. Compare that to the genotypes around a lower but flatter peak. They're also going to be constantly mutating away from the maximum, but the genotypes that differ by mutation or two are almost as good. That means you don't see the big drop-off in fitness as mutations occur, and you end up with a population of viruses with similar genotypes all clustered around that peak, with most individuals not actually having the best genotype, but still being pretty close in terms of their fitness. When a population of fast mutating viruses has subgroups in both situations, a tall narrow peak and a wide flat peak, the latter tends to win, even though in absolute terms the maximum fitness is lower. But that wider peak is more robust, so the average fitness tends to be higher. You've probably heard the term survival of the fittest. The term for the dynamics I've just described is survival of the flattest, and it's how robustness is selected for in populations of fast mutating viruses.
Thanks, Dan.
All within limits. Definite design parameters are going to affect them.
Yes, plasticity is limited by the genome of the organism. That's why when we see adaptation that goes past the plasticity of the genome, it involves changes to that genome, which shifts the window of available phenotypes in the population. And that is something that's observed as we've gone over in both nature and in the lab. It's also a thing which Galuza has spectacularly failed to account for.
So they must be robust and they must be plastic, which from an engineering perspective, we would call resilient. These are highly resilient creatures, and these are design characteristics.
They sure can be, but because they are subject to change with changes in the genome of the organisms in question, and because mutations do occur, and because they can affect reproductive success across generations, they're subject to that bogeyman of ICR, natural selection. And so to show that this isn't just subject to natural forces, Galuza is going to have to do a whole heck of a lot more than just saying that they're also a thing that designers make. That designers make a thing does not mean that nature can't make a similar thing.
So when the Lord made these creatures, He made them robust, He made them plastic, He made them resilient, right from the very beginning of creation, in order to live on a highly dynamic earth.
That wasn't very dynamic on the relevant timescales.
Why? Why? Because highly dynamic things are glorious.
That seems like a highly subjective take.
Highly dynamic things express incredible engineering prowess. Highly dynamic things show the genius of the person who made it.
So do incredibly stable things. No one is impressed by the Great Pyramid in Egypt because of how dynamic it is. Quite the opposite. After this is a bunch of theology about how God would totally be cool if he did X and not Y. I don't care.
So, what creatures seem to do is they seem to be able to anticipate and predict these environmental changes.
Unless they're Chinese people, I guess. because they didn't manage to predict the end of the famine in a way that altered their children's bodies to be better at surviving with more than starvation levels of food.
which leads to not random but highly purposeful adaptations.
Then experiments like the Lenski long-term E. coli experiment and the Luria-Delbruck experiment would have had very different results.
How they do it is by many, many, many innate systems which enable them to self-adjust.
And all of which are evolvable. If you want to overthrow evolution, you need to do two things. One is make points that contradict evolution. The other is, back up those claims. Randy struggles with the first and has utterly failed at the second.
And why do they do it? Why do they continually track environments? So they can maintain their homeostasis. That's a word that goes back to 8th grade biology.
Randy's basically right about that. That is why organisms have evolved the ability to adapt in a single lifetime to varying environments. It's also one of the more remarkable things about life on Earth.
So, if creatures are really engineered, then engineering not only can be informed by biology, but engineering can inform biology. Therefore, I'm looking for corresponding system elements between a human engineered thing, some workmanship here that is doing a function, and creatures which are doing similar functions.
And that would indeed be a prerequisite for demonstrating that creatures are designed. But while it's necessary, it's not sufficient to show that. Also, let's take a look at that New Scientist article, because based on how it's being presented in this video, it looks like New Scientist is agreeing that animals can tweak their genomes to adapt to new environments with some kind of determinism. But then I went and read it, and wouldn't you know, no changes to the genome, just the epigenome. So this doesn't help either. I guess that brings us up to, 0 for 9? Darn it, I had such high hopes.
So this car is a totally autonomous car. It has all kinds of what? What are these things? Sensors. And guess what's inside of it? Computers doing what? Logic. And it can drive itself from San Francisco, if it had a big enough gas tank, to New York City, going around hazards, going around bad weather, going around all kinds of things. Well, these guinea pigs do the same thing. Guinea pigs beat climate change by tweaking their own DNA.
Yep, with methylation tags, not induced mutations. And as this article notes, this is only a temporary solution, and to adapt to the likely future extent of climate change, it will require actual changes to the genome of the guinea pigs, not just changes to the epigenome. The problem is that those mutations may not come fast enough, because in terms of Earth history, the current change in climate is happening orders of magnitude faster than in the past.
They took these male guinea pigs, okay, the males are back on the hot seat, in this case literally, and they put these male guinea pigs in cages with a heating pad on the bottom of it to mimic climate change. Well, if you know anything about male guinea pig anatomy, what's sitting on the hot plate?
Balls.
It is. And they roasted them for 70 days, a long enough time to make one cycle of sperm. They mated these male guinea pigs with female guinea pigs which were not in hot conditions. They looked at the pups. Lo and behold, the pups have modifications to the expression of at least 18 different genes that enable them to live in a hotter environment.
And none to the genes themselves. Randy just can't stop shooting himself in the foot.
One generation. Do you think these male guinea pigs have a temperature sensor? Do you think they have logic? Do you think they have output? Of course. So we're looking for corresponding system elements on top of that. We're looking for the sensors that are all over your cells, all over your body. We're looking for innate logic, which we find in the nucleus and other places, and we're looking for appropriate adjustments all across the board.
But it's that last one that's causing the problem. Look, it's not like there's nothing to epigenetics and phenotypic plasticity being important ways in which organisms quickly change and adapt to survive a rapid change in the environment. But the problem is that it's not enough. We know, for example, that organisms in the Lenski experiment have changed their genome considerably. This has to be accounted for. Humans have actually gone and identified the specific mutations and when they occurred in that experiment. We can't just hand-wave them away with papers showing no change to the genome of the organisms in question. That's a losing strategy, and the thing is, other creationists know it. Jason Lyle has a 2-part series all about how wrong Randy Galuza is on this, and he used to work for ICR. In fact, I suspect he left ICR because he didn't want to be associated with this nonsense. But it's not just Jason Lyle. Answers in Genesis knows that natural selection is real. Even Kent Hovind, who is basically the bottom of the procreationist barrel, understands that natural selection is real. When even the other creationists think your ideas are bonkers, it's probably time to pack it in.
Therefore, if we want to approach biology from an engineering standpoint,
which there's no reason to do,
knowing how design things operate, oh, that would be so good if every biologist had to take Engineering 101.
And as soon as we see the organisms of this world being engineered in the wild, I'll consider that a good idea too.
Here's the obvious question. Why aren't biologists sent to Engineering 101?
Because there's no evidence biological systems have been or are being engineered except by humans in laboratories, and only starting very recently.
Because they don't believe it was what? Engineered. That's why they don't go to it.
Yep.
But I'm suggesting knowing how design things operate can greatly inform our understanding of how living things operate. We would do it faster, we would do it more efficiently, we would do it with less cost. And that, just like this space shuttle, as I mentioned last night, which is going to traverse through all of the different environments, has its solutions built in right from the beginning, we should expect the same thing in creatures.
And they often do, just for different reasons. In this case, it's because the mutations that will be beneficial in a new environment already exist, so the population can quickly adapt to changes. The problem is that mutations aren't designed or deterministic, so this doesn't help the creationist side at all.
That they will have their solutions built in right up front. Therefore, prediction time. When it comes time to figure out how these anticipatory systems work, what am I predicting? Well, one thing is this. Their capacity, just like the capacity on anything, is going to be fully internal. I'm not saying 99%, I'm saying 100%. 100% of the ability of these anticipatory systems is going to be found within the organisms, highly regulated by control systems.
And the fact that some bacteria in the Luria-Dilbrook experiment never adapted to the antibiotic means that this idea has already been falsified for like 8 decades.
An organism will relate to its environment by its built-in control systems. That's a prediction of what we're going to find.
I like that we got predictions. Too bad that the other predictions of this idea have already been known to be incorrect since before the idea was proposed. This is seriously like someone coming along and telling you about their hot new theory of fire called phlogiston theory. Then I point out that, no, that's been replaced by oxygen theory for a very long time. At this point, the person points to a bunch of experiments that confirm that oxygen is indeed the thing that makes flammable things burn, and says, "Ha! Checkmate, oxygenist."
This man here, he's passed away. He was, at the time, the world's leading researcher on anticipatory systems. He did a good job of describing what one was. He says, an anticipatory system is a natural system that contains, okay, this is really good, an internal predictive model of itself and its environment. That is really cool. That means it has an internal system that can model what? Itself and model what? Its environment. It's modeling them both, and it's where? Inside. Inside. Which allows it to change state in what? An instant, in accord with the model's predictions pertaining to a later instant. So it's making a model which is predicting what's going to happen in the future, but it's changing itself now. That is really cool.
It is really cool, and we know that some organisms meet that definition as individuals, but Randy needs them to meet that definition as populations. Randy basically can't figure out the difference between mental foresight, population mechanics, genetic mutation and variation, epigenetic phenomena, and phenotypic plasticity. All of these things are just swimming around like a fever dream in Randy's mind, and just like in a dream, he picks out parts that only relate to his own imagination, and smashes them together in ways that don't make any sense, don't explain anything, and which only sound plausible because his audience has no idea about the biology he's talking about.
So, are we going to find this within creatures? Yes. Based on this research that they had done, they found that locusts, grasshoppers, dragonflies, and flies seem to use what? Internal models of the surrounding world to tailor their actions adaptively to predict the imminent future.
Yep, which determines things like how they move their legs in response to likely outcomes in the next few seconds. It has nothing to do with creating new genetic variations in response to potential future environments. This paper is perhaps the least relevant thing to that topic that has been in the video. Really, go ahead and read it. Let me know if you can draw any relevance from this to the phenomenon of populations adapting to new environments that require genetic changes.
Where are the models? Nobody knows.
I would think inside the brains of the animals in question. They are cognitive models, after all.
But I'm predicting they're going to be there.
So is everyone else.
And on top of that, evidence of an internal model at the neural circuit level has also been shown in fruit flies. These examples highlight an important aspect of internal models whereby the state of the system should modulate the processing of sensory information. So where might we turn to look for things that we're going to find? Well, if we know how man-made things work, maybe it'll give us a clue about the biology. Well, here's one. Humans have put together systems to model the weather. Well, if we were to look at one of these weather models, we would find 4 things in a weather model. First, somebody, probably some physicist, came up with mathematical equations characterizing the physics of natural phenomenon. In other words, they studied clouds and they made up physical models in math to model what clouds do, wind does, humidity does, temperature does, all of these things. Some physicist.
We get it. Move to another point.
Second, all over the world they put up weather stations which gather data.
As long as they don't gather lore.
3, they store in data banks what has happened in the weather in the past.
Previous data is important because it's what came before.
And then 4, they put together these incredible equations which are able, as they say, to step forward in time and establish initial conditions. So they've got the models, they've got the real-time data that they're collecting, they've got all the historical data that they've stored up, and they're putting it together and they're predicting what's going to happen next week.
Yep, that's the kind of thing we call science. And the thing is, I already did that in this series. I tested Randy's idea against actual data, and it came up short. Why hasn't Randy bothered to do the same? Well, it's because he's not interested in science. He's interested in sciencey sounding nonsense that will convince his co-religionists not to move away from his particular theological brand, and also to keep money coming into his institute.
Okay, what am I predicting are going to be in creatures? Guess what they think? They're going to have these things. I predict that when we reverse engineer these creatures and we start to really figure out what's happening in their anticipatory systems, we're going to find programs, equations. We know that they have sensors, which are taking in data all the time. I'll bet we're going to find there's some stored reference information and there's mechanisms which enable them to step forward in time.
Yeah, probably. But still, this is about individual organisms. We need to be talking about populations if this is to relate to evolution. Because evolution, whether it be universal common descent or just diversification of the alleged kinds after the flood, is a population phenomenon, not a thing that happens to or is performed by individual organisms. This is a fundamental category error. This is flat earth level argumentation right now. This is basically the same as saying that since a spirit level is flat, and since the horizon is level, then the earth is flat. It shows a complete ignorance or willingness to ignore the most basic facts about the ideas and theories one is arguing against.
There you go. I say creationists don't make predictions. These are predictions.
They are predictions. They're just not predictions that evolution wouldn't make. So they can't be used to distinguish between evolution and young earth creation. They're neutral on that one.
In fact, not only the predictions, if ICR had the money and we had the staff, I would say this would be a great research program, wouldn't it? This would be a wonderful research program. So it's telling us what we're going to do. and it would show how organisms continuously track environmental changes, not only in real time, but proactively.
And then we'll need to see them then using that tracking to induce mutations in their offspring or their own bodies, including their germline. But that's it. After this, it's just him hawking his humble wares. Well, that was a frustrating mess of internal incoherence. I want to say a special thanks to Dr. Dan Sturgeon-Cardinal for helping me with this, including by giving me a short video of his to use. Please do go subscribe to him. He deserves your attention. If you like this video, please remember to hit like, subscribe, and turn on all notifications. Also, make sure you leave a comment. Even if you hated the video, you can tell me what's wrong with it. Either way, I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Thanks for watching, but before you go, I just want to say a special thank you to my channel members and my patrons, especially those pledging $20 or above. Bob Knob, Work in Progress, Benthoven, Cynically Skeptic, Denny5252, Ian Chen, John Ackerman, Landon Knoll, Mabdy Babdy, McSpooks, Sphincter of Doom, The Venerable Bede, and Patrick Dennis. As you probably know, YouTube is a very volatile platform, and from month to month my income on the channel can swing wildly. But the people you see on screen are directly supporting so that I don't have to worry too much about that, and the channel can keep going as it is, and perhaps even improving. If you'd like to join this team, there are links below to join the channel or in the description to join the Patreon. The Patreon starts as low as $1 a month, and the channel memberships start as low as $1.99 a month. On Patreon, you can even get a discount for pledging annually. If you do decide to pledge, you'll get access to an exclusive Discord server just for channel supporters, as well as early access to all of my pre-recorded videos, often up to 2 months in advance. Higher tiers will unlock even better perks. Now, if the annual or monthly pledge isn't right for you, but you still want to support the channel, there is a merch store down in the description, as well as an Amazon wishlist, just for me. And if financial support isn't something you can or want to do, then if you still want to help out the channel, please just like and share these videos and make sure you comment on them. It really helps the channel out. Thanks again for watching.